In this video, you will learn how to run your Flex application from within Flash Builder. This process will compile a Swift file and generate a convenient HTML wrapper file, which you can modify for your own browser display needs. You will also learn about some basic compiler settings and deal with a couple common compiler and browser issues that you might encounter during development. In Flash Builder's Package Explorer, I have 3 projects currently open. The one I want to focus on right now is this solution project for an application that you will build in day 5. I'm expanding the project and looking in the source default package directory for the main application file, which I'm double-clicking on to open. Bear with me please in these first few videos as I spend a little extra time emphasizing the Flash Builder features and terminology that you learned in the earlier video on using Flash Builder. I will be less descriptive of my actions as the series progresses. Let's focus for a minute on this main application file. I am double-clicking on the Editor tab to maximize the view. This is the MXML code that handles the user interface display. I'm double-clicking again to minimize the view and then expanding the skins folder. I'm opening the panel container skin.mxml file. You will build this in a later exercise, and it is a skin for the panel container. I'm going to maximize the view, and as I scroll down, you can see some ActionScript code to handle the panel header bar color. You will learn more about all of this code throughout the course. For now, focus on the fact that all this code, plus the code in these other custom skin and component files, will be compiled into a Swift file. It is the actual Swift file that is moved to the production environment for download and interaction with an end user. I'm clicking on the Run button here in the menu bar to have Flash Builder display the Flex application in a browser. Note 3 things. First, by default, Flash Builder will use your system's default web browser. In this case, mine is Internet Explorer. You can change the default browser in Flash Builder by selecting Window, Preferences, General, Web Browser. Next, you should be aware that if you have multiple projects open, you can choose the project to run using this drop-down menu. Lastly, note that this Run As submenu identifies that the project will run as a web application. Also consider the URL path of the application. The URL points to the default Adobe Flash Builder 4.5 workspace that I discussed in an earlier video. Then it points to the Exercise 5.08 solution project, and then to the BinDebug directory, which I'll discuss in a minute. And then finally to an HTML file. Note that the name of the HTML file is based on the name of the main application file. Next, I'm locating the BinDebug directory in the Package Explorer. Remember that when you create a project, one of the settings defines the output folder for the compiled Swift. By default, this is defined as the BinDebug directory. You can change the folder name, but it is common practice to leave it alone. I'm closing this wizard. When I expand the BinDebug directory, you can see the HTML file that was referenced in the browser URL, as well as the compiled Swift. Later in this video, I will discuss the other files and folders in the BinDebug directory. For now, note that the BinDebug folder does not include the components or skins folder, since all the code in these source files are compiled into the Swift. So by default, if you look in the project menu, you will see that there is an option called Build Automatically that's checked. This option tells Flash Builder to attempt to compile the application each time the project files are saved, and this can be quite convenient. So let's say that I accidentally mistype some code. I'm going to mess up some of my code, and then when I save it, you will see the compile error is immediately shown here in the problems view. I've corrected my syntax error and resaved the file so the error message is gone. Let's spend some time looking at the Flex compiler settings, which you can find by selecting Project, Properties, Flex compiler. The settings are organized into these 4 sections: Flex SDK version, Adobe Flash Player options, compiler options, and HTML wrapper. By default, your Flex applications will be compiled for the Flex 4.5 SDK. If you want to use an earlier framework, you can select this radio button and choose an SDK. The options are Flex 3.6 and 4.5. In an earlier video, I showed you the installation directory for Adobe Flash Builder 4.5. Note that the SDKs listed there match the ones listed here in the Flex compiler settings. In a later video, you will learn about some of the new Flex components available in Flex 4.5. If you switch to an earlier SDK, just note that you will not be able to use newer components in your application. In the Adobe Flash Player Options section, you can explicitly target a version of the Flash Player. Let me show you how this relates to the HTML wrapper file generated by Flash Builder for the Swift display. I am closing the Flex compiler settings for a moment. Now, if I double-click on the HTML file, it opens in the internal web browser, which I don't want. So let me close that and right-click on the file to select Open with Text Editor. I am double-clicking on the Editor tab to expand the window and then scrolling down to locate the JavaScript variable right here that declares the minimum Flash Player target to be 10.2.0 for this application. If the end user's browser does not have this version of the Flash Player, the user will be prompted to upgrade. I am double-clicking on the Editor tab again to minimize this view. The third section of the compiler settings allows you to set some common compiler options. The first checkbox declares whether you want the Flex 3 MX components to use the new Flash text engine. You will learn more about MX components and the FTE in later videos. The second option tells the compiler to copy all of your assets like images into the BinDebug folder. You will need to do this if your assets are being called at runtime from the Swift file. To learn more about the Generate Accessible Swift File option, go to the Flex Accessibility website here. Enable strict type checking enforces strict data typing during compilation, and Enable Warnings enables warning messages in Flash Builder, like the one you saw when I created the error in my code. Lastly, you can type additional compiler arguments into this text field. The HTML wrapper section defines some settings in the HTML wrapper file. The Generate HTML wrapper file checkbox will do just that, create the HTML file to wrap the Swift file. If you have the Use Express Install checkbox selected, the wrapper file will check whether the user has JavaScript enabled to perform Flash Player detection. The browser also must have at least version 6.0.65 of the Flash Player installed so that it can initiate the update process that installs the latest version of Flash Player. The Enable Integration with Browser Navigation selection will allow the user to use the back and next buttons in the browser to navigate the Flex application. This is also known as deep linking. Back in the BinDebug directory, note that the player product install.swift file is necessary for Express install, and the history directory is related to the deep linking feature. Here's the HTML wrapper file code again. Notice that this HTML wrapper implements a JavaScript library named swiftobject.js. This is actually version 2 of the Swift Object Library, which is a standards-based library that embeds Swift files in HTML pages. This library also abstracts the implementation details about the Flash Player detection, the Swift embedding, and more. Here's the code to embed the Swift file, which is generated for you by Flash Builder. You can take this HTML file and modify it any way you want for deployment in your application. The last files we need to discuss in the BinDebug directory are these Swift files that have specific Flex Framework version numbers appended to them. These files are related to the Flex Framework's implementation of Runtime Shared Libraries, or RSLs. Consider the fact that most Flex applications will use the core Flex Framework classes and perhaps some of the other libraries. Every time a user accesses a Flex application on the web, they will have to download all of these libraries, which is a waste of bandwidth. If a user has already accessed one Flex application, then they ideally would not need to download all the Flex Framework elements again. Runtime Shared Libraries help accomplish this goal. An in-depth discussion of RSL is outside the scope of this course, but take a look at the dialog when I select Project, Properties, Flex Build Path. By default, the Framework Linkage dropdown is set to Use SDK Default, Runtime Shared Library. In other words, by default, this Flex application is set to use the RSLs on the end user's computer if they already have them. If the user doesn't already have them, the Flex application will deliver these Swift files to their computer. These files, in other words, are backup. In Flex 4.5, only RSLs that are truly dependent on your code will be linked in your application, and if you choose MX only, Spark only, or MX and Spark, the appropriate libraries will be linked. Lastly, I want to alert you to a couple of issues you may encounter during development. If you swap out assets, or if for some reason Flash Builder doesn't properly recompile an application, you can force the project to recompile by selecting the Project Clean menu. You can clean all the projects or select specific ones to clean. This will force the projects to be rebuilt and can sometimes clear up some unexpected behavior. One last point before we move on to the next video. You may occasionally encounter this error that specifies that the Swift cannot access a local resource. If this happens, close all instances of your browser and then run your application again. Browsers set their security when they start up, and sometimes that session is not prepared to run your Flex application. Simply restarting the session resets the browser security. For your next step, work through the exercise titled Setting Up Your Project Files.